The body lay between the rose beds. That is the image I cannot remove from my mind, no matter how many months have passed, no matter how many other cases Poirot and I have encountered since. The body of a woman in a white dress, her dark hair spread upon the gravel path like ink spilled across parchment. One hand extended toward a trellis of climbing bourbon roses, as though she had reached for something beautiful in her final moment. Her name was Marguerite Holloway. She was 42 years old, and until the afternoon of July the 14th, she had been the most admired woman in the village of Alderton St. Cross. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, was present that afternoon by the purest accident, or perhaps by the intervention of whatever force it is that continually steers my old friend Hercule Poirot toward murder the way a compass needle swings toward north. We had been visiting the Cotswolds on a matter of no consequence, an authentication of a miniature portrait that Poirot had been asked to examine by an elderly collector in Burford. The business concluded by noon. I'd persuaded Poirot to remain for the afternoon and enjoy a cream tea at the Lamb Inn before motoring back to London. It was there, over scones and strawberry jam, that we encountered Miss Felicity Dane, an old friend of mine from my army days, or rather, the sister of an old friend, which amounts to much the same thing in the peculiar arithmetic of English social connection. Arthur Hastings. I don't believe it. She was a lean, weathered woman of 50, the sort who breeds spaniels and serves on parish councils and regards London as a form of communicable disease. "What on earth are you doing in the Cotswolds?" I explained. She brightened. "Then you absolutely must come to the Holloway's garden party this afternoon. Marguerite throws the most glorious do every Bastille Day. She's half French, you know, and half the county turns up. There'll be champagne, a string quartet, and the most extraordinary garden you've ever seen. Marguerite designed it herself. She's a genius with plants." I glanced at Poirot, expecting resistance. He loathed garden parties. He loathed gardens. He regarded the English obsession with horticulture as a form of collective madness, and had once described a herbaceous border as nature's attempt at chaos with a trowel. But to my surprise, his eyes had acquired that particular gleam. "Holloway," he murmured. "The name, it is familiar, not Marguerite Holloway, formerly Marguerite Delacroix." Felicity blinked. "Why, yes. You know her." "I know of her. Many years ago, in Paris, the name Delacroix was connected with a certain affair, a matter that was never resolved. I should be most interested to renew the acquaintance." He dabbed his moustache with a napkin. "We accept with pleasure, Mademoiselle Dane." And so, at 3 o'clock on a blazing July afternoon, we turned through the gates of Hartley Grange and drove up an avenue of lime trees toward what I can only describe as a horticultural paradise. The house itself was handsome, a Georgian manor in pale Cotswold stone, its proportions elegant, its facade softened by wisteria that must have been planted a century ago. But it was the garden that arrested the eye and held it. It spread from the south terrace in a series of descending levels, each one a distinct world, a formal parterre of clipped box and lavender. A rose garden of staggering beauty, with over 200 varieties, a wild meadow section alive with butterflies, and, at the lowest level, a water garden surrounding a lily pond fed by a natural spring. Guests milled across the lawn, perhaps 60 people. Champagne flutes catching the sunlight, conversation rising and falling like the murmur of bees. A string quartet played Debussy beneath a marquee. The air was thick with the scent of roses, jasmine, and warm grass. "Magnificent," I said. Poirot sniffed. "The garden, yes. It has order, purpose. Each section relates to the next with a logic that is almost mathematical. Whoever designed this understands not merely plants, but composition. The mind behind this garden, Hastings, it is a mind of precision. You sound as though you admire it." I admire the mind. The mud, the insects, the pollen that makes one sneeze. These I do not admire. But the mind, yes. Felicity steered us through the crowd, making introductions with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to organizing village fetes. And it was thus that I first laid eyes on the inhabitants of Hartley Grange and the people whose lives were about to be torn apart. Marguerite Holloway met us on the terrace. She was striking rather than beautiful. Tall, slender, with dark hair threaded with early silver, and the kind of bone structure that would age magnificently. Her eyes were remarkable, very large, very dark, with an expression that combined warmth and assessment in equal measure, as though she were perpetually deciding whether to embrace you or catalogue you. Monsieur Poirot. Her voice carried the faintest trace of France, like a perfume that has almost faded. I've heard your name, of course. Felicity tells me you are here by chance, but I have learned not to believe in chance. Madame is wise. Chance is merely the name we give to patterns we have not yet understood. She smiled, a slow, complicated smile, and turned to introduce her husband. Hugh Holloway was everything his wife was not. English to his marrow, ruddy, solid, genial, with the build of a man who had once been athletic and had settled contentedly into comfortable middle age. He pumped my hand with the enthusiasm of a retriever greeting a returned master. Hastings, splendid. Any friend of Felicity's. And Monsieur Poirot, an honor. Read about you in the papers. The Styles case, wasn't it? Riveting stuff. You are too kind, Monsieur Holloway. Hugh, please, no formality here. It's a party, for God's sake. Drink champagne, admire the roses. My wife will tell you the Latin name of every bloom if you let her. He laughed, loud and genuine, and moved on to greet other guests. But I noticed that Marguerite did not watch him go. Her gaze had drifted elsewhere, toward a man standing alone at the edge of the rose garden, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was impossible to misread. He was perhaps 45, lean, dark, with a face that looked as though it had been carved by someone who valued severity over charm. His clothes were expensive but carelessly worn, the collar slightly askew, the jacket unbuttoned. Everything about him suggested a man whose attention was consumed by something other than his appearance. "Who is that?" I asked Felicity quietly. "Julian Ashford, Marguerite's oldest friend. They grew up together in the south of France. Childhood sweethearts, some say. He's an artist, rather a good one, actually. Lives in the village. He and Hugh don't exactly get on." "I can imagine. It's not what you think. Or perhaps it is. No one quite knows. Julian has been part of the furniture here for 20 years. He and Marguerite collaborate on the garden. She designs, he paints it. The paintings sell for extraordinary sums. It's an unusual arrangement." An unusual arrangement. Yes. I filed that away and turned my attention to the other guests. There was Edward Holloway, Hugh's younger brother. A quieter, sharper version of Hugh, with watchful blue eyes and a thin mouth that seemed perpetually on the verge of saying something cutting. He managed the estate's business affairs and was, Felicity confided, deeply resentful of the money Marguerite spent on her garden. He thinks it's frivolous, says the estate needs investment in the tenant farms, not 200 varieties of rose. He and Marguerite have been at daggers drawn for years. Then there was Mrs. Cordelia Fane, a widow of 60-something who had been Marguerite's closest female friend for a decade. She was one of those women who maintain an aura of youthful elegance through sheer force of will. Beautifully dressed, meticulously groomed, with a laugh that chimed like crystal but eyes that calculated like an accountant's. She was in love with Hugh before Marguerite came along, Felicity murmured, steering me past the champagne table. Everyone knows. Hugh proposed to Cordelia first, actually. She turned him down, said she wasn't ready. Then Marguerite arrived from France, and that was that. Cordelia's been the devoted friend ever since, which tells you either that she's a saint or that she's playing a very long game. Finally, there was Thomas Bright, the head gardener, a man of 60, with a weathered face, knotted hands, and an expression of permanent disapproval. He moved among the guests like a terrier patrolling its territory, straightening stakes, deadheading a spent bloom, radiating silent indignation at having civilians trampling his domain. "Thomas has been at Hartley Grange since before the Holloways," Felicity said. "He knows every plant, every root, every inch of soil. The garden is as much his creation as Marguerite's. More, some would say, though he'd never admit it." The party proceeded. The champagne flowed. The string quartet shifted from Debussy to Ravel. The sun blazed, and beneath the gaiety I sensed, or imagined I sensed, a tension that had nothing to do with the heat. It was 4:30 when Marguerite excused herself from a conversation and walked alone into the rose garden. I watched her go, a solitary figure in white moving between banks of crimson and gold, and felt a prickle of unease that I could not explain. 15 minutes later, Mrs. Fane went to find her, and Mrs. Fane's scream, high, raw, terrible, brought the party to an end. I reached the rose garden before most of the guests. Poirot, despite his short legs and his aversion to hurrying, was beside me. What we found stopped me cold. Marguerite lay on the gravel path between two beds of old Bourbon roses. Her white dress was stained crimson, not from the petals, but from a wound in her side just below the ribs. A pair of garden shears lay beside her, their blades dark with blood. Dr. Simmons, a local physician who had been among the guests, was already kneeling beside her, his fingers at her throat. He looked up, his face grey. "She's dead." The words severed the afternoon in two. Before them, a garden party. After them, a murder. Poirot knelt, gingerly, for the gravel offended his knees, and examined the scene with those sharp, bright eyes that missed nothing. He did not touch the body. He studied the shears, the position of the hands, the angle at which she had fallen. He looked at the roses, at the trellis, at the ground. Then he stood, brushed his trousers with fastidious care, and said quietly, "This was not an accident." "The shears," someone began. "The shears did not fall from a height. They did not slip from a shelf. The wound is in the left side, angled upward. Madame Holloway was right-handed. She did not do this to herself. Someone stood here, among these roses, and drove those shears into her body." The guests, those who had not already retreated to the house, stood in frozen horror. Hugh Holloway pushed through, saw his wife, and made a sound I never wished to hear again. It was not a cry, not a word, just a noise torn from somewhere deep, the sound of a world collapsing inward. Julian Ashford stood apart, utterly still, his face the color of the gravel path. He held his champagne glass in a hand that did not tremble, and his stillness was more frightening than Hugh's anguish, because it spoke of a grief too vast for any outward expression. Edward Holloway appeared at the edge of the garden, his face unreadable. Mrs. Fane had collapsed onto a bench, sobbing, and Thomas Bright, the head gardener, stood among his roses with a look of such fury that for a moment I thought he might be about to confess. Instead, he said, "Those are my shears. I sharpened them this morning." And that, in its terrible simplicity, was how the case began. The police arrived from Chipping Norton within the hour. Inspector Caldwell, a solid, methodical man with a thick Oxfordshire accent and a dislike of complications. He took one look at the scene, interviewed Dr. Simmons, cordoned off the rose garden, and declared that no one was to leave the estate until further notice. Poirot, after a brief and somewhat combative discussion with the inspector, was permitted to assist in the investigation. Caldwell, I suspect, had heard enough of Poirot's reputation to know that refusing him would be more trouble than it was worth. "Just don't touch anything," Caldwell said, "and don't go telling people what to think before I've had a chance to ask them what they know." Poirot inclined his head with the grace of a man who fully intended to do exactly what he pleased while appearing to comply entirely. We began in the garden. The rose garden at Hartley Grange was not merely a collection of plants. It was, as Poirot had observed, a composition. The beds were arranged in concentric circles around a central stone sundial, each ring devoted to a different era of rose cultivation. The outermost ring held the modern hybrid teas. The next ring contained the Edwardian varieties, then the Victorians, and at the center, closest to the sundial, the oldest roses of all, the Bourbons and the Damasks, some of them descended from bushes planted in the 18th century. It was between the innermost beds, the oldest roses, that Marguerite had been found. Poirot walked the paths with painstaking slowness, his eyes moving from ground to bush to trellis. I followed, trying to see what he saw, and failing as usual. "Tell me, Hastings, what do you observe?" "Gravel paths, rose beds, the shears, the sundial." "And what do you not observe?" I looked again. "I don't understand. There are no footprints." I stared at the ground. He was right. The gravel was fine and dry, the kind that should have shown impressions. Marguerite's body had displaced the stones where she fell, and our own footprints were visible. But there were no other marks. No prints leading to or from the spot where she had been attacked. How is that possible? Someone stood here and stabbed her. And yet the gravel shows only Madame Holloway's approach, a single set of prints from the outer path inward. No one else walked here. Then the killer came from a different direction, through the flower beds. Poirot stepped carefully to the edge of the nearest bed and examined the soil between the rose bushes. It was dark, moist, recently mulched. The plants were dense, thick canes, heavy foliage, thorns. No disturbance. The mulch is undisturbed. No broken canes, no trodden stems. No one forced their way through these beds. Then how? Poirot straightened, his eyes alight. That, mon ami, is the question. A woman is stabbed in a garden. There are no footprints but her own. No one approached through the beds, and yet she did not kill herself. He looked around, his gaze lingering on the sundial, the trellises, the roses themselves. The garden knows how it happened. We must learn to read its language. He spent 20 minutes examining the shears. They were heavy, professional tools, the kind used for cutting thick, woody stems. Thomas Bright had confirmed they were his, kept in the potting shed at the far end of the garden. They had been freshly sharpened that morning. "When did you last use them?" Poirot asked. Bright's face was a mask of controlled fury, not at the question, but at the desecration of his domain. "This morning. I was pruning the ramblers on the north wall. I finished at noon and returned them to the shed." "And the shed? It is locked." "In this house." Bright's contempt was magnificent. "Nothing's ever locked. Mr. Holloway doesn't believe in locked doors. Says it's a country house, not a bank vault. So anyone could have taken the shears. Anyone with 2 hands and a pair of legs, which rules out nobody." We visited the potting shed. It was a substantial structure of brick and timber, well organized, fragrant with the smell of earth and fertilizer. Poirot examined the tool rack where the shears had hung. He noted the position, the surrounding tools, the doorway. Then he crouched, an operation that involved considerable ceremony and a muttered French imprecation about his knees, and examined the floor. "Hastings, here." I knelt beside him. On the flagstone floor, near the base of the tool rack, was a small smear of something dark and sticky. Not blood, it was the wrong color, brownish-green with a faintly acrid smell. "What is it?" Poirot did not touch it. Instead, he leaned close and inhaled, very carefully. "Plant sap," he said, "but not from a rose. The smell is distinctive, bitter, almost medicinal. I have encountered it before." He stood, brushing his knees. We must speak with Mrs. Holloway's garden notebooks. I understand she kept meticulous records. Notebooks? How will notebooks help? Because this garden, Hastings, is not merely decorative. It is a diary. Every plant chosen, every arrangement made, tells a story. Marguerite Holloway was a woman who expressed herself through flowers. If we can read what she planted, we may understand what she wished to say. It sounded fanciful to me. But then, most of Poirot's methods sounded fanciful until they delivered results. We found the notebooks in Marguerite's private study, a room at the back of the house overlooking the water garden. It was a beautiful space, filled with botanical prints, seed catalogues, and shelf upon shelf of leather-bound journals. Each was meticulously dated and filled with her handwriting, elegant, precise, in a mixture of English and French, documenting every aspect of the garden's development over 20 years. Poirot took the most recent volume and began reading. I, with nothing else to do, took an earlier one. After 20 minutes, I had learned more about soil pH and rose rootstock than I ever wished to know, and was no closer to understanding how any of it related to murder. Poirot, however, had gone very quiet. "Hastings, come here." He pointed to an entry dated 3 months earlier, April of that year. Marguerite had written, "Planted the monkshood along the eastern border of the water garden, A. napellus, the deep blue variety. Thomas disapproves. He says it is too dangerous, that the roots are deadly. I told him I know precisely how dangerous it is. That is why I planted it. Monkshood, I said. Isn't that a conatine? Aconite, one of the most poisonous plants in England. Every part of the plant is toxic. The roots, the leaves, the flowers. It was known in the Middle Ages as the Queen of Poisons. Handling the roots with bare hands can cause numbness. Ingesting even a small amount can be fatal. She planted poison in her own garden. She planted it deliberately. And note what she says. I know precisely how dangerous it is. That is why I planted it. This is not the remark of a careless gardener. It is the remark of a woman with a purpose. He continued reading. The entries over the following weeks were increasingly cryptic. References to the arrangement that must end and what was buried 20 years ago. One entry, dated just 10 days before the party, read, "Julian says I must tell Hugh. He is wrong. Some truths are better left in the soil. They nourish what grows above, even when what grows above is a lie." Julian Ashford, I said. The artist, the childhood sweetheart. The man who looked at Madame Holloway this afternoon with the eyes of a man who has loved and lost and never ceased either. You think they were having an affair. Poirot closed the journal. I think, Hastings, that the word affair is too simple for what existed between Marguerite Holloway and Julian Ashford. But whatever it was, it is connected to this garden and to her death. The following morning was overcast, the sky pressing down on the Cotswolds like a grey wool blanket. The gaiety of yesterday's garden party might have been a dream. The marquee had been taken down, the string quartet's chairs stood empty on the lawn, and in the rose garden, a police constable stood guard over the spot where Marguerite Holloway had died. Poirot conducted his interviews in the morning room, a south-facing space that on any other day would have been flooded with light, but today was merely grey, matching the mood of the household. Hugh Holloway came first. He had aged a decade overnight. His ruddy complexion had turned sallow, his eyes were red-rimmed, and the hearty manner was gone entirely, replaced by a quietness that was, in its way, more affecting than weeping. I loved her, he said simply, when Poirot asked about his marriage. I know that's what every husband says, but I loved her from the moment she walked into that gallery in Paris in 1912. She was standing in front of a Monet, and I thought she was part of the painting. Luminous, that's the word. And your marriage, it was happy? Hugh considered this with the honesty of a man too exhausted for pretense. It was real, which is better than happy and worse than easy. Marguerite was... She had depths I never reached. I knew that. She had a life before me in France that she never fully shared. Julian was part of that life. I accepted it because I had no choice and because I trusted her. Did you have reason not to trust her? If you're asking whether she and Julian were lovers, I don't know. I never asked. I decided early on that the answer either way would make me miserable. If she said yes, I would be destroyed. If she said no, I would always wonder if she was lying. So I didn't ask. A stoic approach. An English approach, Monsieur Poirot. We're rather good at not asking. Yesterday afternoon, where were you when your wife went into the rose garden? On the terrace, talking to the Hendersons about their bloody drainage problem. I can tell you the exact composition of their soil if you'd like. Clay over limestone, poor percolation, not exactly stimulating conversation. I was there for at least 20 minutes before Cordelia screamed. And you saw nothing? Nothing. The rose garden is below the terrace, behind the yew hedge. You can't see into it from above. That's by design. Marguerite wanted it to feel enclosed, private. A garden within a garden, she called it. A garden within a garden, a private space hidden from view. The perfect place for a secret meeting, or a murder. Julian Ashford was next. He entered the room as though walking through deep water, every movement deliberate. Waited. He sat down, placed his hands flat on his thighs, and waited. Monsieur Ashford, you and Madame Holloway were childhood friends. More than friends. His voice was low, steady, stripped of ornament. We grew up in Grasse. Her mother's family had a perfumery. My father was an English painter who'd settled in Provence. Marguerite and I were inseparable from the age of 8. And in adulthood? In adulthood, we were everything to each other except what the world would call lovers. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware that no one believes it. But the truth between two people is not always the truth the world recognizes. You painted her garden. I painted everything she created. The garden was her masterpiece. I was merely its chronicler. Her journal mentioned something buried 20 years ago, a truth that should remain in the soil. What was she referring to? Ashford's composure, which had been absolute, faltered. His hands pressed harder against his thighs. I cannot tell you that. Cannot, or will not. Both. He looked at Poirot with eyes that held a pain so old it had become structural, part of the architecture of his face. Marguerite kept a secret for 20 years. She kept it to protect someone she loved. I urged her to speak. She refused, and now she is dead, and the secret dies with her. Unless someone killed her because of it. Ashford said nothing. Monsieur Ashford, yesterday afternoon, where were you? In the meadow garden, sketching. I'd positioned myself near the wildflower section to capture the light on the grasses. I was there from 3 o'clock until I heard Mrs. Fane scream. The meadow garden is adjacent to the rose garden. You would have been close. Close enough to hear, not close enough to see. The yew hedge separates the two. It is 8 feet tall and impenetrable. You heard nothing before the scream, no voices, no struggle. Nothing. But the string quartet was playing. There were 60 guests talking and laughing on the lawn above. One would not have heard a conversation in the rose garden even from 10 feet away. He rose. I will tell you one thing, Monsieur Poirot. Marguerite was not afraid. Whatever she was keeping secret, she was not afraid of it. She was afraid for someone. There is a difference. He left without waiting to be dismissed. Edward Holloway was a contrast to his brother in every way. Where Hugh was open and emotional, Edward was closed and precise. He answered each question with the minimum words necessary, as though language were a resource to be conserved. Your relationship with Marguerite? Professional. She was my brother's wife. I managed the estate. We disagreed about the garden. The disagreement was financial? She spent £1,200 last year on rare plant specimens. 1,200. The tenant farms need new roofing. The north barn is collapsing. I told Hugh, but Hugh does whatever Marguerite wants. Wanted. The correction seemed to cost him something, though whether it was grief or merely grammar, I could not tell. You resented her. I resented the waste, not the woman. Where were you at 4:30? In the library. Working. I don't attend garden parties. I find them frivolous. Anyone can confirm this. The library has a door to the corridor and a door to the garden. I used neither. Draw your own conclusions. After he left, I said, "He's hiding something." Everyone is hiding something, Hastings. That is the human condition. The question is whether what they hide is relevant to murder. Mrs. Cordelia Fane's interview was an altogether different experience. She arrived in a cloud of perfume, something heavy and floral that fought with the lilies on the mantelpiece. Her face carefully made up, her grief expressed through the precise application of waterproof mascara. "I found her," she said, and her voice, despite the theatrical presentation, carried a tremor of genuine distress. "I went to look for her because Hugh was asking. She'd been gone 15 minutes. I walked into the rose garden and there she was." "You touched the body?" I knelt beside her. I took her hand. It was still warm. I screamed. I don't remember anything after that until the doctor came. "Mrs. Fane, you were Marguerite's closest friend. For 10 years, she was everything I am not. Talented, beautiful, brave. I adored her." Her eyes filled, and for a moment the mask slipped, revealing something raw beneath. "She was the best person I knew. And yet you were once engaged to her husband." The mask snapped back into place. "That was a very long time ago. Hugh and I were young. It didn't work out. He found Marguerite, and I was happy for them both." "Were you?" "I learned to be." "Isn't that the same thing?" "In my experience, madame, it is not at all the same thing." She left, and Poirot sat for a long time, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes closed. I had learned over the years not to disturb him during these silences. The little grey cells were at work, sorting and connecting, testing and discarding. At last, he opened his eyes. "Hastings, we must return to the garden." "What are we looking for?" "Something that should be there and is not, or something that is there and should not be. The garden, mon ami, is the witness. We have been interviewing the people. Now we must interview the plants." The afternoon was spent in the garden, and I confess that for me it was the most bewildering part of the investigation. Poirot moved from section to section with a concentration that was almost reverent, pausing at each bed, examining leaves and stems, reading the labels that Marguerite had placed beside her specimens. He spent a long time in the water garden, where the monkshood grew. Tall, stately plants with hooded flowers of deep blue, beautiful and deadly. He did not touch them. "Aconite," he murmured. The ancients used it to poison arrow tips. It was said that the plant sprang from the saliva of Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the entrance to the underworld, a plant associated with death from the very beginning. "You think the monkshood is connected to the murder?" "I think Marguerite planted it for a reason. She was not a careless woman. Every plant in this garden has a meaning. Come." He led me to a section of the garden I had not previously noticed, a small walled enclosure near the potting shed, hidden behind a screen of clematis. Inside was a collection of plants quite different from the showpieces in the main garden. These were wilder, more unruly, herbs, mainly, growing in tangled profusion. I recognized rosemary, thyme, and sage. Others I did not know. Poirot read the labels. Digitalis, belladonna, hemlock, henbane. He looked at me. "This is a poison garden, Hastings." "A what?" "A collection of toxic plants. They exist at several English estates. Alnwick Castle has a famous one. They are educational, historical, maintained under controlled conditions. Marguerite's journal mentions establishing this section 3 years ago. She called it Le Jardin des Ombres, the Garden of Shadows. Why on earth would she grow poisons? Because she was a woman who understood that beauty and danger often share the same root. But observe something, Hastings. He pointed to a section of bare earth near the back wall. The soil had been recently disturbed, dug up and turned over, the surface rough and uneven. Something has been removed. A plant has been dug out, root and all, quite recently. See, the soil is still dark, still moist. This was done within the last few days. He knelt and sifted the earth with a stick carefully. After a minute, he found something, a fragment of root, pale, fibrous, with that same bitter smell I had noticed in the potting shed. Aconitum napellus, monk's hood. Someone has removed an aconite plant from this bed, dug it up entirely. The roots, Hastings. The roots are the most toxic part. The smear on the potting shed floor. Aconite sap. Someone brought a monk's hood root into the potting shed recently, and in the potting shed they would have had access to the garden shears. The picture was forming, though I could not yet see its shape. Someone had dug up a poisonous plant, brought it to the potting shed and... what? Handled the shears while handling the root? Poirot was ahead of me. He always was. The shears, he said softly. They were the murder weapon, yes. But consider the wound. Dr. Simmons described it as deep, precise, delivered with considerable force. Now, garden shears are heavy, unwieldy, not a natural weapon for stabbing. One would need strength, proximity, and, most importantly, to take the victim by surprise. Marguerite was taken by surprise. She was found facing the trellis, reaching toward the roses. Her back was to her attacker. She did not see them coming. But there were no footprints. No. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And that is the detail that transforms everything. Because if no one walked through the garden to reach Marguerite, then either the killer was already there, hiding, waiting, or they reached her by a means that left no trace on the gravel. How? Think, Hastings. What is the one structure in the rose garden that a person could use to approach the center without walking on the gravel paths? I looked toward the rose garden, the trellises, the arched trellises that supported the climbing roses, forming tunnels of greenery between the beds. The trellises. Someone could have climbed along the trellis framework. Not climbed. The structures are decorative. They would not support a person's weight. But think lower. What runs beneath the beds? I remembered something from Marguerite's journal. An irrigation system. Pipes. She had installed an underground watering system. Narrow channels lined with stone, running beneath the beds, connecting to the central sundial where a tap controlled the flow. The irrigation channels. Précisément. The channels are narrow but deep, perhaps 18 inches wide and 2 feet deep. A slim person, on hands and knees, could move through them beneath the rose beds without disturbing the mulch above. They would emerge at the center of the garden, near the sundial, within arm's reach of the path where Marguerite stood. That's extraordinary. But who would know about the channels? Someone who built them, someone who maintained them, someone who knew this garden not merely as a visitor but as an intimate, someone who understood its hidden structure as well as its visible beauty. Thomas Bright, Julian Ashford, or Marguerite herself, who had designed them. But Marguerite is the victim, I protested. Poirot looked at me with that expression of gentle patience I knew so well. Yes, Hastings, she is. But that does not mean she did not know her killer was coming. The following morning, Poirot asked to see Julian Ashford's paintings. Ashford's studio was a converted barn at the edge of the village, a 10-minute walk from Hartley Grange. Inside, the space was chaotic in the way that artists' studios always are. Canvases stacked against walls, paint-stained rags, the sharp smell of turpentine. But the paintings themselves were anything but chaotic. They were extraordinary. Canvas after canvas depicted the garden at Hartley Grange in every season, every light, every mood. The rose garden in June, blazing with color. The water garden in autumn, its lilies bronzed and fading. The meadow in spring, alive with primroses. Each painting captured not just the appearance of the garden, but its essence, its order, its logic, the intelligence of its design. But Poirot was interested in one painting in particular. It hung on the far wall, separate from the others, and it was different, darker, more troubled. It showed the poison garden, le jardin des ombres, rendered in deep blues and purples, the monk's hood dominating the foreground, its hooded flowers almost menacing. And in the center of the painting, barely visible among the shadows, was a figure, a woman. Kneeling, her hands in the earth, her face turned away. "When did you paint this?" Poirot asked. "Last autumn. Marguerite asked me to. She said she wanted a record of the poison garden before she changed it." "Changed it how?" "She planned to remove the aconite. She said it had served its purpose." "What purpose?" Ashford sat on a paint-splattered stool and rubbed his face with his hands. He looked like a man coming to a decision he had been postponing for years. 20 years ago, he said at last, something happened, in Grasse, before Marguerite came to England, before she married Hugh. Poirot waited. Marguerite had a younger sister, Colette, beautiful, trusting, 19 years old. Colette fell in love with a man, an Englishman who was visiting the region. He was charming, attentive, everything a girl of 19 dreams of. They had an affair, and when Colette became pregnant, the man disappeared. Returned to England. Left no address, no word, nothing. And Colette was devastated. She took her own life, drowned herself in the river outside Grasse. Marguerite found her. The room was very quiet. Even the dust motes seemed to hang motionless in the shafts of light. Marguerite never forgave herself for not seeing the signs, for not protecting her sister, and she never forgave the man who destroyed her. She came to England a year later, found him, married his brother. I felt the floor shift beneath me. Hugh's brother, Edward. Edward Holloway was the man who seduced Colette Delacroix and abandoned her to her death. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing a blow. Marguerite married Hugh not for love? She loved Hugh, eventually, truly. But her reason for coming to England, her reason for entering this family, was Colette. She wanted to be close to Edward, to watch him, to make him live under the same roof as the sister of the girl he had destroyed. A slow revenge. Not revenge. Witness. She wanted him to know that she knew, and she wanted to decide, in her own time, what to do about it. The poison garden. Yes, she planted it as a symbol, a reminder. Every toxic plant in that garden represented a different poison, the poison of betrayal, of abandonment, of silence. The monk's hood was Colette, the hooded flower, beautiful and deadly, the queen of poisons for the queen of sorrows. And the truth she wished to keep buried? That Edward was responsible for Colette's death. If Hugh knew, it would destroy his relationship with his brother, his family, perhaps his marriage. Marguerite weighed her desire for justice against her love for Hugh and chose silence. For 20 years. Until recently. Until recently, something changed. Edward began pressuring Hugh to sell parts of the estate, the tenant farms, the woodland. Marguerite suspected he was in financial trouble. She began to wonder whether Edward's debts might be connected to other secrets. Other women, perhaps, other abandoned lives. She started investigating. and she told me she was going to confront him at the garden party. She told you this. She told me 2 days before. I begged her not to. I said it was dangerous. She said she was tired of carrying the weight. She said the truth was in the garden, that everything she had planted was a confession waiting to be read. She said she was going to dig up the monk's hood, Colette's plant, and present it to Edward, make him face what he had done. But someone dug up the monk's hood before her. Ashford stared. What? The aconite in the poison garden has been removed, dug up recently, root and all. The sap was found in the potting shed near the shears. Ashford's face went white. Then someone knew, someone heard her plan. Or someone who understood the garden well enough to read its meaning, as you say, to see the monk's hood for what it represented and to understand what Marguerite intended. We left the studio in silence. Outside, the Cotswolds rolled green and golden under a clearing sky, indifferent to human suffering, as landscapes always are. "Hastings," Poirot said, "we must speak with Thomas Bright again." "The gardener? You think he—" "I think Thomas Bright has been in this garden for over 20 years. He knows every plant. He knows why each one was chosen. And if Marguerite Holloway's garden was indeed a diary, a confession written in soil and stem and blossom, then Thomas Bright is the one person who could read it." We found Thomas Bright in the potting shed, cleaning tools with the mechanical precision of a man performing a ritual. He looked up as we entered, and his expression was not surprise but resignation, the look of someone who has been waiting. "I wondered when you'd come back," he said. "Then you know why we are here," Poirot replied. Bright set down the trowel he had been wiping and sat heavily on an upturned crate. His hands, knotted with decades of outdoor work, rested on his knees. "I've known what that garden meant since the day she planted the first belladonna," he said. "Mrs. Holloway, Marguerite, she didn't just plant flowers. She planted stories, every bed, every border, every specimen. It was her way of speaking without words. And the monk's hood? I knew about Colette. Not at first, but over the years she told me. In pieces. A word here, a confession there. The way you talk to someone who works beside you in the dirt every day. She trusted me. God knows why. Perhaps because I'm not family. Not a friend. Just the man who tends the soil. She told you about Edward Holloway." Bright's face hardened. "That she did. Told me what he did to that poor girl in France. Told me she'd come to England to face him. Told me the garden was her way of keeping the memory alive. Every year, when the monk's hood bloomed, she'd stand and look at it and whisper Colette's name." "You dug up the monk's hood," Poirot said. It was not a question. Bright nodded slowly. 3 days before the party. She told me what she was planning, that she was going to confront Edward, pull the aconite up by the roots and lay it at his feet in front of everyone. A public accusation. I told her it was madness. Edward's a cold man, dangerous maybe. You don't corner a rat and expect it not to bite. So you removed the plant. I thought if the monk's hood was gone, she couldn't go through with it, that she'd lose her nerve or find another way. I dug it up at dawn and brought it to the shed. Was going to dispose of it, but she noticed. Of course she noticed. She knew every inch of that garden better than I knew my own face. She was furious. We argued. She said she'd find another way to force the truth out. And did she? Bright's face crumpled. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular anguish of a man who tried to prevent a catastrophe and failed. I don't know what she did, but on the day of the party, she was calm. Too calm, the way she gets got when she'd made a decision. She told me, "Thomas, the truth is in the garden. It always has been. Today I'm going to let it bloom." Those were her exact words. And then she walked into the rose garden and she didn't come out. "Mr. Bright, on the afternoon of the party, where were you?" "In the kitchen garden, on the other side of the house. Getting salad for Mrs. Jenkins, the cook. I was there from 2 o'clock until I heard the screaming. Anyone with you? The kitchen boy. Sammy. He was helping me dig potatoes. Poirot studied him for a long moment. You are not the murderer, Monsieur Bright. No. Bright's voice was rough. But I dug up that bloody plant. And maybe if I hadn't, she'd have done what she planned and exposed Edward before he could stop her. Maybe she'd still be alive. Or perhaps she would be dead regardless. The killer's intent was formed before the monk's hood was removed. The plant was a symbol. The truth was the weapon. After Bright left, Poirot turned to me with an expression I knew well. The concentrated stillness of a man who sees the completed picture. Hastings, I need to examine the rose garden one more time. There is something I have missed. Something that has been present from the beginning, visible to anyone who looked, and yet unseen. What? The roses themselves. Poirot spent an hour in the rose garden that afternoon, moving from bush to bush, reading the labels, consulting a small reference book he had borrowed from Marguerite's study. I stood at the edge, watching, understanding nothing. At last he returned, and his face was alight with that particular radiance that meant the case was solved. Hastings, do you know the Victorian language of flowers? Vaguely. Red roses for love, that sort of thing. That sort of thing, yes. But far more elaborate. In the 19th century, every flower carried a specific meaning. A yellow rose signified jealousy. White clover meant, think of me. A striped carnation meant, I cannot be with you. It was a code, Hastings. A way of communicating emotions that could not be spoken aloud. And Marguerite used this code. The entire rose garden is a message. I've been reading it. The outer ring, the modern hybrid teas, these are planted in a sequence that tells a story of arrival. New beginnings. Hope. The next ring, the Edwardian roses, tells of courtship and marriage. The Victorian ring speaks of duty, endurance, hidden sorrow. And the center, the Bourbons? The center, Hastings, is the confession. The oldest roses surrounding the sundial are arranged in a very specific sequence. Marguerite placed them according to their meanings in the language of flowers, and what they spell out, when read in order from east to west, is this: betrayal, grief, accusation, and justice. A message encoded in roses. A message that has been growing in this garden for 20 years, visible to anyone who knew the code. And one person here does know the code. One person who has studied the Victorians, who has an intimate knowledge of flowers and their meanings, who has spent a decade in this garden, learning its secrets. A chill ran through me. Not Julian, not Edward, not Bright. No, Poirot's voice was very quiet. Cordelia Fane. I stared at him. Mrs. Fane is the president of the Alderton Street Cross Horticultural Society. She is an expert in Victorian garden design. She has published articles on the language of flowers in Country Life magazine. She has always known exactly what Marguerite's garden was saying. But she was Marguerite's closest friend. She was. And she was also in love with Hugh Holloway. Has been perhaps for 30 years. She turned down Hugh's proposal once. Not because she wasn't ready, as she told you, but because she believed she could do better. When she realized her mistake, Marguerite had arrived, and it was too late. But that's motive for jealousy, not murder. Jealousy is the root, but the flower that grew from it is something darker. Consider, Hastings. Mrs. Fane spent 10 years as Marguerite's companion. 10 years watching the woman who took the man she loved. 10 years reading the garden, understanding its coded accusations, knowing that Marguerite was guarding a terrible secret about Edward. You think Fane knew about Colette? I think she decoded the garden years ago, and I think she saw, in the secret of Edward's crime, an opportunity. Poirot began pacing, his words falling faster now. Mrs. Fane's husband died 4 years ago, leaving her with less money than the world supposes. She has been living beyond her means, maintaining the appearance of comfort while her resources dwindle. She needs security. She needs a home. She needs Hugh Holloway. You think she killed Marguerite to have Hugh? I think she killed Marguerite to silence her, because Marguerite was about to expose Edward, and if Edward were publicly disgraced, the scandal would engulf the entire Holloway family. Hugh would be devastated. The family name would be ruined, and Mrs. Fane's dream of eventually becoming the second Mrs. Holloway, a dream she has nursed for 30 years, would be destroyed along with it. She killed Marguerite to protect the family she wanted to join. Précisément, a terrible irony. She loved Hugh. She wanted to protect his reputation, his happiness, his ignorance. And to do so, she murdered the wife he adored. But the method, the shears, the footprints. How? The irrigation channels. Mrs. Fane knew about them. She helped Marguerite design the water system. It is mentioned in the garden journals. She's a slim woman. She could navigate those channels easily. During the party, while the guests were on the upper lawn and the string quartet was playing, she slipped away. She entered the irrigation channels from the access point near the potting shed, moved beneath the rose beds to the center of the garden, and emerged behind Marguerite as she stood at the trellis. She took the shears from the shed. She had placed them there earlier. She visited the potting shed that morning. Thomas Bright mentioned seeing her near the shed before lunch, though he thought nothing of it. She handled the monkshood root that Bright had left there, hence the sap on the floor, and she took the shears. At the critical moment, she emerged from the channel, struck from behind, replaced the shears beside the body to suggest an accident or an impulsive act, and returned through the channels. And then she walked into the rose garden from the main path and screamed. And then she discovered the body. She knelt beside her friend. She took her hand. She screamed. And the performance was perfect because the grief was real. She had loved Marguerite in her way, but she loved Hugh more, and she loved the life she imagined with him more than anything. Can you prove it? The channels. If Mrs. Fane crawled through those channels, there will be traces. Fabric from her clothing caught on the stone edges, soil on her knees that matches the subterranean earth, perhaps scratches on her hands from the rough stone. Inspector Caldwell can examine her clothes from that afternoon and compare the soil samples. And the motive? The motive is written in the garden, Hastings. Every rose Marguerite planted was an accusation. Every bloom was a word in a confession that Cordelia Fane read, understood, and finally decided to silence. Poirot chose to confront Mrs. Fane, not in the morning room, but in the rose garden itself. It was, he said, fitting. The garden was the witness. It should also be the courtroom. Inspector Caldwell, forewarned, had stationed 2 constables at the garden's entrance. Hugh Holloway was present, as was Edward. Julian Ashford stood apart, his face haggard. Thomas Bright leaned against the potting shed wall, watching. Mrs. Fane arrived last, immaculate in black, her face composed behind a veil. She had dressed for mourning with the same care she brought to everything. Deliberate, polished, controlled. Cordelia, Poirot said, using her Christian name for the first time, I wish to tell you a story. She sat on the bench near the sundial, her gloved hands folded. Once, Poirot began, there were 2 women. One was brilliant, passionate, carrying a secret that burned inside her like a flame. The other was patient, elegant, carrying a different kind of fire. The fire of a love unrequited for 30 years. Mrs. Fane did not move, did not blink. The first woman planted a garden. Into the soil she poured her grief, her anger, her accusation. Every flower was a word, every season was a sentence. The garden grew and bloomed and spoke for those who had ears to hear, and one person heard it. One person read the roses and understood the story they told. "You are speaking nonsense," Mrs. Fane said, but her voice was thin. The second woman decoded the garden. She understood that her friend was keeping a terrible secret. A secret about a man in this family. A secret that, if revealed, would destroy everything. And the second woman made a choice. She chose silence. She chose